Hello, welcome to Learning Studio. Today's video is all about the history of Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders DSM. What is DSM? How and when it is developed? Why was there a need for DSM? What was the goal of DSM? This video will answer all your queries, so let's begin the video. The need for a classification of mental disorders has been clear throughout the history of medicine. But until recently there was little agreement on which disorders should be included and the optimal method for their organization. The many different classification systems that were developed over the past 2,000 years have differed in their relative emphasis on phenomenology, etiology, and courses defining features. Some systems included only a handful of diagnostic categories. Others included thousands. Moreover, the various systems for categorizing mental disorders have differed with respect to whether their principal objective was for use in clinical, research, or administrative settings, because the history of classification is too extensive to be summarized here. This summary focuses only on those aspects that have led directly to the development of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders DSM into the Mental Disorders sections and the various editions of the International Classification of Diseases ICD. DSM-5TR. The DSM-5TR development effort started in spring 2019 and involved more than 200 experts, the majority of whom were involved in the development of DSM-5. These experts were given the task of conducting literature reviews covering the past 9 years and reviewing the text to identify out-of-date material. 4 cross-cutting review groups like culture, sex and gender, suicide, and forensic reviewed all the chapters, focusing on material involving their specific expertise. The text was also reviewed by a work group on ethnoracial equity and inclusion to ensure appropriate attention to risk factors such as racism and discrimination and the use of non-stigmatizing language. Although the scope of the text revision did not include conceptual changes to the criteria sets, some necessary clarifications to certain diagnostic criteria were reviewed and approved by the DSM Steering Committee, as well as the APIA Assembly and Board of Trustees. DSM-5TR was published in March 2022. DSM-5. The work on DSM-5 began in 2000. Work groups were formed to create a research agenda for the 5th major revision of DSM-5. These work groups generated hundreds of white papers, monographs, and journal articles, providing the field with a summary of the state of the science relevant to psychiatric diagnosis, and letting it know where gaps existed in the current research, with hopes that more emphasis would be placed on research within those areas. In 2007, APIA formed the DSM-5 task force to begin revising the manual, as well as 13 work groups focusing on various disorder areas. DSM-5 was published in 2013. DSM-3R and DSM-4. Experience with DSM. 3rd edition DSM-3 revealed inconsistencies in the system and instances in which the diagnostic criteria were not clear. Therefore, APIA appointed a work group to revise DSM-3, which developed the revisions and corrections that led to the publication of DSM-3R in 1987. DSM-4 was published in 1994. It was the culmination of a 6-year effort that involved more than 1,000 individuals and numerous professional organizations. Much of the effort involved conducting a comprehensive review of the literature to establish a firm empirical basis for making modifications. Numerous changes were made to the classification. For example, disorders were added, deleted, and reorganized to the diagnostic criteria sets and to the descriptive text. Developers of DSM-4 and the 10th edition of the ICD worked closely to coordinate their efforts, resulting in increased congruence between the two systems and fewer meaningless differences in wording. ICD-10 was published in 1992. Development of DSM-3, as had been the case for the DSM and DSM-2. The development of the 3rd edition DSM-3 was coordinated with the development of the next version of the ICD-9, which was published in 1975 and implemented in 1978. Work began on DSM-3 in 1974, with publication in 1980. DSM-3 introduced a number of important innovations, including explicit diagnostic criteria, a multi-axial diagnostic assessment system, and an approach that attempted to be neutral with respect to the causes of mental disorders. This effort was aided by extensive work on constructing and validating the diagnostic criteria and developing psychiatric interviews for research and clinical uses. ICD 9 did not include diagnostic criteria or a multi-axial system, largely because the primary function of this international system was to outline categories for the collection of basic health statistics. In contrast, DSM 3 was developed with the additional goal of providing precise definitions of mental disorders for clinicians and researchers because of dissatisfaction across all of medicine with the lack of specificity in ICD. 9. A decision was made to modify it for use in the United States, resulting in ICD 9-CM for clinical modification. Thanks for watching. Make sure to hit the like button, subscribe to Learning Studio,